Often the bosses that kill guilds are not actually the most difficult bosses. It's often still very difficult bosses that are placed way ahead in the raid where they should be. It's actually why my argument that a mid-raid wall is almost always bad, because what it assumes is that basically a boss that's like a second to last boss difficulty or an end boss difficulty is just put in the middle of the raid, and then people get to them when they have no hope of actually killing a boss that hard, that early, with that little gear, and then it just makes guilds fall apart. Like, Brood Twister wasn't egregiously difficult in general, but it was egregiously difficult to be fought right after you were able to kill Rashinan. Rashinan's part of that problem too, being too easy, I guess. Or there only being 8 bosses in the raid to where there couldn't be linear difficulty bosses increasing after Rashinan to get you to a Brood Twister. Like, Anduin and Painsmith and Brood Twister got a lot of heat for being, and Tindral for being, well, Tindral was weird. Tindral was a second to last boss, but like you were able to get to that boss so easily because Naimu and Laredar and Smolderon were relatively easier, but kind of same issue. So is the answer better organization or more freedom of choice between boss progression? Better organization. I mean, I don't know if I've done this before. Before making that argument, I've polled my chat before on, do you guys like a mid-raid wall? And the answer was like overwhelmingly yes. But also like a mid-raid wall just like straight up does this. Like, if you're looking at the difficulty of bosses, in my opinion, a well-done raid, the difficulty is like this, right? It does, like, something like this, and then it goes up, right? And then this, each little tick here is like the bosses in the raid, right? So every boss gets a little bit harder, so it's requiring a little bit more from you. When you get a mid-raid wall, what that changes, you get this. It's like this. That's like what I'm... But, like... This is what people are saying they like. I just feel like this kill... It's not a dick. It kind of looks like a dick. But you get the point. You know what I mean? Like, people say that's what they want, but it's kind of objectively bad for the game. Like if the boss is going to be in the raid anyway, why not have it be later where it makes sense for its difficulty? I feel... Basically, my hot take is that mid-raid walls are always bad, because if that mid-raid wall were just to be put in proper position, the raid would just be better for everyone. I think maybe where people are getting confused with that is when you're saying, do you like a mid-raid wall? You're basically saying, do you like bosses that are often considered mid-raid walls? But those bosses are usually pretty good. Painsmith, Anduin, Ashvane, right? Like, going back in time a little bit, there's a bunch of really good ones, right? I'm trying to think of some other ones. Oh, Gorefiend from like Hellfire Citadel was like another big one. Mistress. Well, Mistress wasn't a good fight, but you know, you get the point. There's like a bunch of these. So actually, like, what bosses could you consider a mid-raid wall? Since like... Let's go all the way back to, like, Miss of Pandaria. Dark Animus, 100p. Siege of Orgrimmar, nothing. Everything in Siege of Orgrimmar was easy till the end. Legion, Emerald Nightmare doesn't matter. Or we didn't skip Warlords. Heimal, Butcher, you could just do near the end. More linear, or less linear. Blackrock Foundry, maybe Operator Thogar, but, like, Blast Furnace is the real answer, but you just did it as the second to last boss because it was less linear. Hellfire Citadel, 100% Gorefiend. Gorefiend is, like, the... quintessential mid-raid wall. It was linear and you had to go through it, and it was way harder than the previous bosses. Legion, Emerald Nightmare, Trial of Valor don't apply. Nighthold didn't really have... I mean, oh, Star Augur, right? But that wasn't like mid-raid. It was like Star Augur, this. Like, this is like, this boss is expected to be hard, and like none of the other ones were really like that level. Nighthold, great raid though. Tomb of Sargeras, Mistress again, but bad boss. And Taurus. Does Iminar count? No, and Taurus didn't have one. Uldir didn't have one. Battle to Zaralor certainly didn't have one. Eternal Palace, Ashvane, absolutely. Ashvane was harder than Orgazoa and Queen's Court, the two following bosses. Also a great boss. Uldir had Fetid. It definitely had one. Only because it was overtuned. Fetid was only that way because it was miserably overtuned, and then once they nerfed it, it was not a hard boss. Like, Fetid wasn't that much harder than, like, Zekvaz, Vectis. You could choose between Zekvaz or Vectis when you could do Fetid Devourer after Mother, and it was very similar to difficulty in those after nerfs. The version of Fetid Devourer that people glorify and, like, state was this crazy boss is a version of a boss they watched on stream during the Race World First that wasn't killed and was nerfed. Nyalotha? Nah. Maybe Ra-Den? But it's not really a wall because you can go around it. You know what I mean? Like, because of Nyalotha's layout where there was, like, all these wings, if you ever got to a boss that was truly a wall, you would just go to the other wing and kill the easier bosses next. So it's, like, harder to determine an actual mid-raid wall because you just do it later. Same thing with Blackrock Foundry. Okay, Castle Nathria? Nah. Zymox? Question mark? Zymox is easier than all of the bosses after it. Council Blood Sledgefist. But like Zymox, in my opinion, was way harder than like Hungering Destroyer, Enerva, Sun Kings, all those. It's close, but not really. Painsmith, right? One of the most famous ones. We already talked about it. Sepulcher, Anduin. It's funny. Halandris is like one of the hardest bosses ever, but a lot of people don't consider Halandris a mid-raid wall because the version of Halandris that those people saw during the race just ceased to exist very quickly afterwards, and Anduin remained difficult for like everyone who did raiding. So the answer really is Anduin, but like also kind of Halandris. There's just two of them back to back. And then Dragonflight. Any mid-raid walls in Dragonflight? Honestly, Vault of the Incarnates doesn't get enough credit for being a pretty good linearly difficult raid. Like, if you went Aranog, Primal Council, into Teros, into Senarth, into either Kurog or Dathia, into Broodkeeper, into Razageth, the difficulty curve was almost, like, directly linear, with a big spike at the Dathia Kurog spot. Unfortunately, Razageth was just a complete disaster on Mythic. Aberrus. Not really a mid-raid wall, but, like... Okay, Skarn is so interesting. It's so complicated. For us, Skarn was harder than Magmarax, but Echo of Neltharion was harder, so it was only harder than the following boss, not like multiple. Aberrus is fascinating for a few reasons, but like if you were one of the guilds who cheesed Skarn and you just extended forever, this boss was nothing to you. A bunch of guilds did that. But if you were one of those guilds who happened to raid later in the week and then Skarn cheese strat was fixed, and then those guilds were just permanently ahead of you, and you just had to slog through this boss that they made worse after the changes. But it's still harder than only Magmarax and not Echo of Neltharion. And then you could talk about Rashok. So Rashok is another fascinating mid-raid wall take. The only issue is that the boss directly after it was harder than Rashok. That makes the mid-raid wall argument really hard. Rashok was an amazing fight, was a difficult fight. But also, some people killed Rashok in 5 pulls. They literally 5-shot it. So calling that a wall is crazy. Like all the other bosses we raced the world first, and all of the other bosses we fought, Anduin 100, like more than 100 pulls. Painsmith more than 100 pulls. Ashvane more than 100 pulls. All of these bosses for the race were really hard. But then Rashok is super fascinating because I think Echo killed Rashok in 5 pulls, 3 pulls, something like that. 7 maybe, something like it was super, just fucking instantly killed it. Other top 20 world guilds killed it in like sub 20 pulls. But then like the average community guild took a long time on Rashok. So Rashok is just fascinating in that it was basically only difficult for like non-race to world first guilds, which is really rare and that almost never happens. Like difficulty for bosses usually like stays the same between the two. If not, becomes easier, like lower pull counts for other guilds. But that one specifically was just like really easy for good guilds and extremely hard for guilds as he went down the skill ladder. Using pull count, my streamer. Okay, using pull count for like under 10 pulls makes sense. The problem with pull count is when people are talking about like, oh, well, which of these like multiple hundreds of pull count bosses, which one is harder? Well, this one had more pulls, so it must have been harder. That's just missing so much context. When you're talking about whether something died versus like 100 pulls versus 5, there's a very clear, obvious, discernible difficulty difference in those two fights, regardless of fight time or anything else like that. Since Rashok hadn't enraged, the eye level situation of Season 2 really mattered there. Yeah, but like, it was like kind of irrelevant from the first day though. Or should have been. So not really an Aberrus. Okay, what about Amir Drasil? Amir Drasil just definitely... I think the problem, arguably the problem with Amir Drasil is that it didn't. Like, I think people would have appreciated Amir Drasil more, in a way, if there was a mid-raid wall. Or, like, maybe specifically Naimu or Laradar was, like, a lot harder. Because so much of people's pain was just getting to a boss that they weren't good enough to be at yet, or it hasn't been nerfed enough for them like it would be in a normal season, and then they were just, like, going through hell. Like, anytime you're fighting a boss and the majority of your raid thinks this boss is too hard for us or this boss is impossible, whether they're speaking that or not, no one's having fun. No one's having fun. Like it's only like it's fun to progress and like get slightly better after every pull. When you feel like it's a lost cause and you're just getting farmed, like no one wants to do that, right? And that's actually been a consistent problem for multiple raids now. That happened on Tindral, right? That happened on Tindral. That happened in Nerebar Palace. Two raids in a row now where like that specific phenomenon has been very prevalent. You guys one-shot Rashanan, guys which didn't do split swipe to that boss a lot more. The average pull count of Rashanan was like 10 to 19, which statistically speaking isn't a lot for a 4th boss. It's actually very normal. And then Brood Twister, for being a 4th to last boss in the raid, also was not a lot of pulls. The problem is that there's only 8 bosses, and the difference between a 4th boss and a 5th boss, but the 5th boss is also the 4th to last boss, just makes that gap. That's why I have a very strong opinion that 8 boss raids are really difficult to pull off because there's not enough bosses to actually do a good difficulty curve. Like, my take would be Nerebar Palace would have been better received as if there was just simply 2 more bosses in keep Rationing the same, keep Brood Twister maybe a little easier, but like put 2 bosses in between this, and I think everyone's happier. Because again, yes, there's more bosses to do. People who raid for Cutting Edge don't dislike raiding. They dislike raiding when it's miserable and not fun, right? And by having Ration and a Brood Twister is just introducing an environment where people feel like they are doing something they cannot do.